Welcome to Press Coverage. I'm Theo Gremminger, and at Press Coverage, I want to bring you the sharpest guests, and I want to help you find the edges you need to win in fantasy. It's getting more and more difficult to find those edges. Drafters are getting smarter, but we're going to attempt to all offseason long, and I'm really excited today to be joined by Andrew Erickson, who's actually been on Press Coverage before, so big hat tip. The show is not old, but I'm starting to get repeat guests, and welcome back today. Andrew, you're dropping absolute incredible work. Everybody knows your work over at FantasyPros, but what do you have going on like all off season long?
Yeah, so we're just kind of in the weeds of releasing the Fantasy Pros draft kit. So that's going to be dropping on June 1st. So that's kind of the preparation that we're all doing. It's me, Derrick Brown, Pat Fitzmaurice, kind of like dividing, conquering all the stuff that you're going to need for your fantasy drafts as the diehards that are listening here in May. It's like we're going to have your sleepers, we're going to have your players to target. We also are going to have like signature pieces. You know, Fitz is going to be doing something along the lines of like a breakout, a sleeper, a bust on every single team. I'm going to be looking at like running back handcuffs and kind of like ranking each of the number 2 running backs on each depth chart and kind of looking at, okay, like how does this depth chart kind of get upset or what's the most ambiguous backfield? So really excited about kind of diving into those 32 article ones where they're hitting on every single team. It's always a big task because you're like, oh, it's still the 32 teams. And then you're like, oh my God, I've only done half the teams. So that's something we're working on for June. Again, the draft kit's dropping June 1st. I know I just released some stuff about the NFL schedule, looking at playoff matchups, just looking at the schedule overall, especially the season or the beginning of the season, especially when it comes to streaming quarterbacks. You know, if you're going to go with a late round quarterback, you know, you want to make sure that, hey, week 1, who is my guy playing? Because you don't want to be hesitant about like, I drafted this guy to be my late round quarterback. And then, you know, week 1, he plays the Steelers. By the way, it's the Falcons and Steelers in week 1. How is Kirk Cousins going to do? We'll find out. And then my latest article I just released, so it's fantasy football strategy advice for the early snake draft picks. So that's kind of just like a very long-winded version of how I'm viewing the draft boards right now here in May. So looking at the first round, talking about the middle rounds and the approaches I would get into the double-digit rounds, kind of just like general strategy and thoughts about how the landscape is different from last year, looking at the onesie positions and kind of like name dropping some players I like at certain ADPs. So if you're new to my material and you just kind of want an idea of like what I'm about, like that's a perfect article, kind of like dip your toes into the Andrew Erickson pool of fantasy football.
Yeah, no, and again, I highly recommend your work. You're very, very sharp with it. A couple of takeaways of what you just talked about. You guys always have good tools when it comes to like the quarterback pairings, streaming quarterbacks. I've always found that Fantasy Pros does a very good job with that. So I'll be interested to take a look at that. And then, yeah, it's just creeping up earlier and earlier this year. I have actually a Fantasy Pros championship in FFPC on the 30th of May. We do this hardway league where it's the same kind of guys every year. It's like one of the first ones. But that one's dropping in May instead of June this year. So I'm already starting to get ready with that. But it's funny you should mention the handcuff. That kind of resonated with me because I do my zero and hero target list and sort of like values and targets. And this year I took it up a notch and I'm actually working on those rankings myself. But the one player that's kind of difficult to rank and curious how you're like people, these handcuff pluses are all like kind of difficult guys to rank. Like, you know, a guy that was like, a top 12 running back last year. And now you're talking about a guy like David Montgomery being like way up there in the handcuff rankings. But I'm curious with Jaylen Wright because Jaylen Wright's a guy that's streamed up so much in rookie drafts, but he sort of has like 2 pathways here. So how do you treat a guy like that, even though he's technically a RB3, or have you kind of put thought into it? Not to get too off topic, Andrew.
No, I think Jaylen Wright's an interesting guy because currently he's not even the number 2 running back on his team. Like he's the number 3 running back. And again, if you're just assuming that Jeff Wilson is kind of gone from Miami, okay. But we saw them kind of slow play Achane a little bit last year. Like he wasn't playing like immediately. And then obviously they got him going and he had a monster game against the Denver Broncos. So Jaylen Wright to me is someone that you need to, okay, if you're going to draft him in a redraft format, like you got to realize like you're not getting like a lot of production from him like week 1, week 2. So he's like a guy you're going to hold, but potentially also move on from like ASAP because he needs injuries ahead of him on the depth chart. It's more of a contingent upside play where, okay, I'm confident that he can deliver, but it has to be because of an injury. And in his case, it's probably like he would probably need more than one injury. Like even Jaylen Wright to me, like he never really screams like a running back that, okay, he's going to just take over the Miami backfield. Like even if let's say Achane and Raheem Mostert both went down, like I don't think we would just see Jaylen Wright get like 20 touches per game. Like, I still think they would probably involve somebody else on that depth chart. So again, you're not concerned about like, hey, if he gets touches, like, he's going to be productive, but what the path for him to get there? Yes, like there are paths for him to get there, but it's at what cost you're going to pay that versus a running back like a Blake Corum, for example. He just needs one injury ahead, and then he's a top 12 running back. So, like, if you're comparing Corum versus Jaylen Wright, like, I would take Corum over Jaylen Wright just because it's one less guy that you have to get past. And, you would be ranking him very confidently really high just based on the workload that we've seen Sean McVay give running backs.
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting way of discussing it. If you want to get this unknown upside rookie, you don't necessarily have to take Wright because you can get Marshawn Lloyd, you get Corum. All these guys have like a one injury away, and then they're stepping right in. Super interesting take. Looking forward to that article. But we just had the schedule release last week, and I had Dave Kluge on, and then Billy Muzio and I also discussed it in First Class Fantasy. It's just so funny how we're talking about a schedule release like for 10 days, and we don't get tired of it. No other sport has this. It shows the absolute power of the NFL. But what's a game that you're hyped for? And what's a week 17 game that you're interested in targeting?
Yeah, so we'll go right to week 17. So I think that the chalky pick is definitely that Ravens and Texans game. And it's interesting because before that week, I believe it's the Ravens are playing the Steelers, right? So you're getting an AFC an AFC North slugfest, right? That if you're playing in these best ball streets where obviously week 17 is really big for the top prize, like you're just praying that Steelers Ravens game can get you through. Like then that game doesn't totally nuke where all the Ravens teams get killed off because they play the Steelers, who just traditionally like to play games through the mud and just like drag things down, betting the unders on the projected totals in those games. So, but if that game ends up going, being okay, and like the Ravens teams can then advance to week 17, it's like, oh my God, like in the dome against the Houston Texans, like it's just really hard. Again, we're so far out, but as long as everyone's healthy, you have CJ Stroud there, you have the receivers, you have Lamar Jackson. Like, I just don't see how that game doesn't result in a shootout, especially playing in dome conditions. So that's one game that I think the chalkier. That's the game I'm definitely looking at. I think that everyone's kind of like circling it on their week 17 bingo card. But the one that I think is underrated, and I think this was one of my main takeaways just from the schedule release in general, was the Tennessee Titans at the Jacksonville Jaguars. So you're looking at a matchup. So it's outside in Florida. So you're not concerned about any type of weird weather. And I just had this major takeaway when I was looking at all the schedule releasing, looking at using the FantasyPros strength of schedule tool, looking at, who has favorable quarterback matchups and wide receiver matchups, like for the whole entire season. And it seemed like every single team in the AFC South was checking off every single box you wanted. Like the AFC South for so long has been like ridiculed. Like they always have the Saturday 4:30 slot on wildcard weekend, whether it was the Texans hosting, like every single year, this division has always been ridiculed and has always been like, oh, it's like the worst division in the AFC every single year. You see a team basically sleepwalk into the division title. But now, oh, you got Stroud. Oh, you got Richardson. Oh, you got Trevor Lawrence. And even the Titans, like Will Levis, like he looks like he may not be the franchise quarterback for them, but he looks like at least be fun. Like he looks like he's going to just be a very chaotic quarterback, which is going to cause points for his team and the other team too. So I just think that this division in general is one that I'm kind of looking to like be overexposed to. Like I want players on all these teams because I just think there's going to be a ton of shootouts, especially when you have Jacksonville plays in warm weather. You have two dome teams and then the Tennessee Titans that don't have Derrick Henry anymore. Like we have to make sure that we're readjusting and recalibrating that this isn't the Derrick Henry Titans going to run the ball 30 times. Like Callahan is in here and they want to throw the ball. I think they're going to throw the ball a lot more than they did last year and every single year that they've had with Derrick Henry. So I think that's an underrated game, especially because we've been playing outdoors in a division that I think we could see some offensive fireworks.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. And looking at the AFC South as like the shootout division, it's like what a difference a year and a half makes. Derrick Henry leaves. We see that huge stylistic change in Tennessee. I love how you bring up Indianapolis. Love how you bring up Jacksonville. Super interesting division, let alone the Houston Texans, where all those guys are getting steamed up. Let's talk about an ascending offense. Which team takes that huge step forward? Every single year, we get kind of wrapped up in. You bring up you guys are dropping your draft kit. We're doing a draft kit at Player Profiler. Every year, we get into the individual players, but every single season, we see an offense take a big step forward and just raise the production and have ADP crushing seasons from like multiple guys. Last year, Detroit, 2 seasons ago, Miami, Jacksonville, a bunch of them, Seattle 2 seasons ago. Who's an offense that you see ascending that could take a big step forward this year?
So I want to start with just some low hanging fruit. I think that the Bengals are one of these teams where they're just all cheaper than they were last year because just last year was a disaster. Like Joe Burrow got hurt and everything got nuked. But if he is healthy in this offense, I have no doubt in my mind that this is going to be a top 5 offense in 2024. You look at the schedule, right? Going back to the schedule analysis, the Bengals are playing a last place strength of schedule because they came in last place in the AFC North. They did exactly what you want from a team that gets injured. Like you want to have the worst record when it's all said and done. Like the Browns and Steelers making the playoffs was a favor for the Bengals because they have one of the easiest schedules year over year when you're comparing how tough their schedule was last year, dealing with the injuries, and now how healthy they are this year. So from a passing perspective, this is something that I've come to realize when it comes to like rare wide receiver 1 season, like Jamar Chase, I think is going to be the wide receiver 1 this year. And it's because of red zone targets. Like Joe Burrow absolutely loves targeting Jamar Chase in the red zone. And when you look at traditionally who's been the number 1 wide receiver overall in fantasy, it's been the guy that has the NFL leader in red zone targets. CeeDee Lamb last year, Cooper Kupp during his season was the leader in red zone targets. And the other correlation part of that was look at the running backs on those teams last year. Who was the Dallas Cowboys running back? Like Tony Pollard couldn't do anything. Cooper Kupp, the year he was what he was as the number 1 wide receiver. Again, not a running back of relevance. I think it was Cam Akers. Was it Darrell Henderson? I don't really remember because it didn't matter. And now you go to the Bengals. Who's their running back? Joe Mixon's gone. They have Chase Brown and Zach Moss. Zach Moss, in a parallel universe, wouldn't even be on the Bengals because either that Hull guy would have beaten him out or Jonathan Taylor would have just been the starting running back and Zach Moss would have never sniffed the field if Jonathan Taylor hadn't gotten hurt or was dealing with that weird contract negotiation with Jim Irsay. So, I mean, I don't understand why the Bengals would feel the obligation to, we got to get these running backs involved more. We got to get them touchdowns. Like, I just think it's going to be the Joe Burrow show. And especially with this question marks about T. Higgins and what's going on with him. Like, I just love the Burrow and Chase stack. So from an ascending offense point, just from last year, I think the Bengals are going to bounce back in a really big way. But an offense that I think is kind of like a post-type sleeper, I mentioned them earlier, is the Jacksonville Jaguars. Like, they were the darling. Like, everyone was on Jacksonville. Like, they had minus odds to win the AFC South last year. They're the only other team with the Kansas City Chiefs. And I remember writing it up in our Betting Pros articles. Like, look, if you're just going to bet on a division favorite, like at minus odds, just bet on the Chiefs. Like, they're going to probably win their division, even though it looks so great for Jacksonville and it looked great, 8-3 start. And then they just crumbled. They collapsed over the second half of the season. Lawrence got hurt. Christian Kirk basically missed all their games. And I think that teams are just ready to move on. Like, drafters are like, Jacksonville, whatever. Like, we want the Colts, we want the Texans. And I do like those teams for those reasons, but the price tag, like, do we really not expect Trevor Lawrence to be able to rise, get this team to play better than they were last year? I think we can, because I still think if you watch Jacksonville last year, I mean, the amount of plays that were left on the field from their receivers, just like bailing or like not helping Trevor Lawrence out, specifically with Calvin Ridley. I mean, Calvin Ridley's highlight film is a low light film. Like, it's him dropping touchdowns left and right. So adding in guys like a Gabe Davis, like a Brian Thomas, bringing back Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram coming back to work underneath. You have Travis Etienne. Like, again, like, I'm not afraid of this defense. Talked about, I like the AFC South. So Jacksonville, Trevor Lawrence was QB8 last year in ADP. Now he's QB16. What has really changed? Just because that he was overvalued last year and now he's a value? Like, for me, I think Trevor Lawrence could easily be a wave that kind of creates this atmosphere for the Jacksonville Jaguars playmakers to really beat their ADPs.
I actually love these answers, and I think that the Bengals one was great because a lot of times when I ask people this, we try to be a little too sort of creative, and you just go with one that makes a ton of sense. I love the Jamar Chase talk. I actually think this was your colleague, Derrick Brown, Debro, who talked about how, I believe this was him talking about how he thinks we could see a lot of Chase in the slot this year, just because, the Burton replacing Boyd profile is a little bit more on the outside, where Chase could lead the NFL in targets this year. I think that's super exciting stuff from you. And I love the Jacksonville one because I think you're right. This was an offense where there was a lot of very sharp people taking Trevor Lawrence last year, and now he's sort of lost a lot of oomph in best ball ADP and redraft ADP, and even in dynasty ADP, where you reference guys like Anthony Richardson and CJ Stroud, who have both jumped his value in all formats. This could be sort of a big bounce back season for Trevor Lawrence. Anything to add to those things, Andrew?
I think Trevor Lawrence is a little bit undervalued when it comes to his rushing. Like, he does offer a little bit of rushing juice that he did last year. And, it's funny when I'm looking at late round quarterbacks, I'm looking for certain thresholds when it comes to passing attempts and rushing yardage. When you look at the two numbers that you're kind of looking for, it comes down to, can you rush for 250 yards in a season? And can you throw the ball for over 550 attempts? And when I'm looking at some early season projections, some of the guys that are checking off those two boxes. So one is Mahomes, because he does enough rushing and he obviously throws the ball a ton. But the other quarterback there was Trevor Lawrence. Like, this offense throws the ball a ton. They threw the ball a ton last year. Just that the receivers were not making plays for Trevor Lawrence on the other side of every one of his throws. But this is a team that's aggressively looking to throw the ball downfield, especially with Trevor Lawrence. They added Brian Thomas. They added Gabe Davis, two guys that are vertical threats. Maybe that really wasn't Calvin Ridley's game last year, coming back from his suspension. So, again, I would be very surprised. Like, I'm not exactly sure like how things are going to shake out with Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if those two guys combine for way more wide receiver one finishes than we saw from Jacksonville at all last season.
Yeah, and I think some pressure on Doug Peterson, especially after all the goodwill 2 years ago. Last year, a huge disappointment, made some staff changes. He might call the plays this year. That's another thing to look for. Let's quit. Is there a new offensive coordinator hire that gets you excited?
Well, when you sent over the show sheet, you said, which offensive coordinator hire are you most interested in? So it's not for the reason that I'm excited. It's because I'm absolutely terrified. And it's Luke Getsy.
Don't say, okay. I thought we were going to have to talk about Arthur Smith.
Oh, no. That's
go ahead with Getsy.
Everyone already knows. Everyone knows the Arthur Smith spiel. We don't need to rehash that. But for me,
what's Andrew doing?
It's Luke Getsy. So look, the marriage between the quarterback and offensive coordinator is obviously super key. And you'll see the times that when that relationship is not really there, you see offenses kind of sputter out. And, this Raiders team has a lot of interesting pieces to it. You have Zamir White, who looked like a value in ADP. You have Devontae Adams at the top. Jacoby Myers kind of had a swan song season last year, breaking out, finally catching touchdowns, something he could never do as part of the New England Patriots. You have Brock Bowers now coming in as a top 15 overall pick, a rookie tight end that a lot of people are really excited about. And then we have Luke Getsy as the mastermind behind making this all work. And I'm just trying to figure out reasons why we should believe in Luke Getsy getting this done, because we saw him last year with one of the most electric, athletic, fast, mobile quarterbacks in Justin Fields. And the guy seemed like he could not figure out what to do with Justin Fields. So for me, I'm just very concerned about, okay, what is this offense going to look like? Everyone's like, oh yeah, let's put Brock Bowers in the slot. That's easy. And yes, when you're playing the couch quarterback, it's easy to look and say, oh, that's exactly what you do. But Luke Getsy, man, I just don't see the track record of him, especially when you look at coaches that got fired and then were immediately hired. It kind of reminds you of the Kellen Moore situation last year, where Kellen Moore was basically let go from Dallas. They brought him to the Chargers, and then it was a disaster and it didn't work out. Now they were obviously dealing with injuries and a couple other things, but I'm always hesitant. I'm trying to be more hesitant to, okay, the Bears fired Luke Getsy for a reason. Why should we be super excited? I'm not saying that the consensus is excited about Luke Getsy, but the fact is that people are drafting Raiders decently high. And if this offense sputters out, you're going to see a lot of busts come from Las Vegas. So that's just something that I'm kind of really interested to kind of see how things play out. And what we'll kind of learn in OTAs is, Brock Bowers is lined up in the slot. He's unstoppable to cover. We're going to see all of that. So it'll be interesting to see where the ADPs ultimately rest with a lot of these Raiders pieces.
Getsy can't mess with my guy Bowers. Too big to fail, Brock Bowers. Keep on drafting him, everybody. Don't let Andrew pour cold water on the Brock Bowers breakout. But let's talk about these rookies, Andrew. You spend a lot of time now looking at redraft. The rookies are all in there. Who would be, if you could know the final stats of any of these 2024 rookies, who would it be?
So for me, I wasn't trying to, game the system. I know I obviously listen to your show, and a lot of people will mention a player that can kind of okay, if I know what this player does, I'm going to go with this and this and this and this happens. But for me, I'm just taking a guy, Jayden Daniels, because I just want to know, hey, is this going to be my late round quarterback? Because if he's rushing for 500, 600 yards, throwing for 20 touchdowns, is a top 12 quarterback, then I don't have to even think about quarterback in my drafts. I just draft Jayden Daniels. That's all I have to do. If he's going to play again, also play the full season, I would like to know that as well, because I know that's a concern with him. Is he going to be able to stay healthy throughout a 17-game regular season, just because he had the tendency to take big hits at the college level? But look, Jayden Daniels and his Cliff Kingsbury offense, they should throw the ball a ton. They should use his legs. I like the weapons overall, but it's not but we'll be able to find out, hey, if I know what Jayden Daniels does, like I can feel more confident about pressing the button on Terry McLaurin. Just Jahan Dotson bounce back. How do I feel about the running backs? Brian Robinson, Austin Eckler. Like these commanders are pretty cheap across the board. So again, going back to one of your earlier questions, like who's a player that could kind of lift all tides or lift all boats from the tide? I mean, we saw CJ Stroud do it last year with the Texans. Why can't Jayden Daniels do that potentially with the Washington Commanders? You know, he comes in like with a lot of experience. Like he started 55 games at the college level. Like that's super rare. So it's funny that, you know, Anthony Richardson is going so much ahead of Jayden Daniels, but who's a better passer right now? Like
Yep.
I wouldn't argue that it wouldn't be Jayden Daniels as coming in as more of a polished passer from the college level, just because given the amount of reps he got in college. And he also has that mobility as well. So Jayden Daniels for me is the rookie I would absolutely love to know what he does year one.
I love every time somebody talks about Jayden Daniels in this response, it makes a ton of sense. And I actually think Caleb Williams also could go right in here because Caleb's going right at the end of the QB1 line, right around QB11. But you could easily see both of these guys hitting at ADP. I think there's a big argument to leaving your best ball drafts with at least one of these guys. And I think there's also a good chance that the Best Ball Mania winner this year has one of these two guys as their QB2. Just because I think it could be an absolute blow-up situation. They're easy to stack. And then from your Daniels perspective, it's a very nice fit. I mean, I think Cliff Kingsbury got a lot of flack on the way out. Certainly was not a perfect guy in Arizona by any means, but we do have a sample size of him thriving with a mobile quarterback, a two-way talent like Kyler Murray. So we've already seen it before. You could see Jayden Daniels take that big step. I love that response. How about a veteran, a guy where you're like, man, this guy's giving me a lot of problems, and where do I rank him? I would love to know the final stats of this guy.
It's Achane. Like I don't know if someone's already used this, but it has to be Achane for me because every time I look at my rankings, I'm like, am I too high? Am I too low on him? Because he's going to average like 8 yards per carry in this offense. Like he's just super polarizing because, you know, he doesn't have that projectable workload that we feel good about when we're drafting running backs super high. It's like, okay, like we know the floor is there. We know he's going to get a decent amount of volume because we know volume is super dependent and super correlated to running back fantasy points. Like that's just, you know, simply put. And Achane doesn't really have that. Like it's okay, he's going to get enough volume, but we're also banking on him being really efficient. And that should carry over. Like the system is the same and he's an explosive playmaker. So those things kind of should work. But at the same time, like it wouldn't surprise me either way if Achane, okay, like he's not getting as many touches, like he's not averaging 8 yards per carry. Now he's averaging 5 yards per carry. So like, but that matters because he's not getting enough volume. You know, we're all kind of assuming Raheem Mostert is going to get hurt. Okay, well, when does that happen? like when is Mostert actually going to go down so that Achane can really be in the driver's seat for this offense? Now, the other thing too with the Dolphins, is just in general, is we know they start out the season really strong, but when the weather turns into a little bit colder, we see the Dolphins obviously isn't as good. So there are a lot of question marks with Achane, but at the end of the day, I look up and I'm like, man, you know, just betting on an uber efficient guy, betting on someone that's good. You know, at the end of the day, you know, that was something that I really kind of talked about last year. I was really high on Travis Etienne when everybody was telling me, well, Tank Bigsby's taking over. It's the Tank Bigsby show. He's going to take out all the goal line carries. I'm like, I didn't think Tank Bigsby was very good. I just didn't think that he was good. And Etienne was really good in his first year as a full-time running back. So it's like, why are we just going to fade this guy when we know he's good at football? Like sometimes it can be that just that simple. And that's kind of how I ultimately fall with Achane. But I would just absolutely just love to know, like, okay, like he's going to rush for over 1,000 yards. He's going to score 10 touchdowns. Like, okay, I can feel good about pushing the button on him in round 2 or round 3 because it's just like you usually don't see running backs with his archetype go this high. Usually these guys are more valuable, like we've seen in the years with Tony Pollard when he was playing alongside Ezekiel Elliott. No, he was like a 7th or 8th round pick where it's like, okay, like draft this handcuff, a lot of upside. You're not drafting him in round 2 or 3. But with Achane, it's like, I mean, you can look up week 1 and be like, the guy got 5 touches in week 1 and I drafted him in the 2nd round. Like, oh my God, what am I going to do? So I think Achane for me is just someone I would do. Please, Theo, tell me what he's going to do this year, please.
He's going to ball out. It's Devon Achane season, and I love drafting him at cost. I think that people, especially in best ball, it's like people are so cowardly with the best ball treatment of him now where you don't need him to play every single game in best ball. I just need him to play a significant amount of games during the regular season, and I need him in the money weeks. But there's very few players where if I say, Andrew, give me the running backs that could average 20 points per game this year. Just could you rattle those guys off for me? And you would come up with a couple, but it's really about 4 or 5 tops. And Devon Achane is right there. And the other guys you're going to mention are all going ahead of him. So for me, it's the upside, it's the talent. We've already seen it. And you've been doing this a while. I remember when people were fading Jaylen Waddle heading into year 2 and his ADP slipped. I remember when there was people fading Alvin Kamara in year 2. I mean, we see a lot of times when it doesn't make sense to us, the production doesn't make sense and the player doesn't have a massive sample size, there's always going to be people fading it. With Devon Achane, I'm leaning into it. I'm going to draft him at cost for better or for worse. And hey, I'll read your handcuff article and I'll figure out where I need to put Jaylen Wright in my draft process for if he goes down, or maybe double tap with Mostert, something like that. But we've seen Miami, unbelievable production. Devon Achane led the NFL in runs over 40 yards last year on like 103 carries. The guy's unbelievable. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're giving you players to fade. And I'm sure you've seen in a bunch of your podcasts or YouTube shows you watch, everybody's doing it right now in May. Don't draft this guy. Don't draft this guy. Fade this guy. But we're going to do it a little different. Andrew and I are not only going to tell you which players to fade at their ADP, but we're going to give you a pivot, a better selection that you can make either right next to this player or a few picks later, right when we come back.
This episode is made possible by Underdog Fantasy, and Underdog Fantasy is the leader in best ball. When you go to join an Underdog Fantasy best ball draft, it fills very quickly, especially now. It's Best Ball Mania season, baby. Best Ball Mania 5. I can't believe they're at Best Ball Mania 5 already. $15 million in prizes. They're giving out $15 million with $1.5 million to first. Playing in best ball leagues makes you better. It helps train you on player value and strategy. And Underdog offers a lot more than just best ball contests. They offer pick'ems. My new favorite, the golf pick'ems. But they have the NBA pick'ems, baseball pick'ems going on throughout the offseason. Hit the pick'ems, back to best ball, hit the pick'ems. So use promo code Underworld. Promo code Underworld gets you a 50% deposit bonus up to $250. So they've increased the maximum deposit bonus. It was $100. Now it's up to $125. When you get the Underdog app, use promo code Underworld and go draft your ass off.
Welcome back to Press Coverage. Theo Gremminger with Andrew Erickson of FantasyPros, ready to rock. We're going to give you these players. We're going to give you players to fade and players to pivot to. We're going to be referencing Underdog ADP. And why are we referencing Underdog ADP? Well, because there's the most data. We'll have a little more FFPC data shortly. We'll have, all sorts of different formats. But for right now, I think Underdog's the best place to find the ADP. There'll be a little differences here and there, redraft versus best ball, but it's going to be fairly similar. So, Andrew, you're going to get people all fired up here. You're going to get people angry. You're going to get some people depressed. But why don't you let some people know your first fade and the pivot you would make?
Yeah, so my first fade is CJ Stroud for the Houston Texans. I know that people don't like it, but I'm just looking at CJ. I'm just looking at the numbers, man. Last year, again, as great as a rookie as he was, did not crest 20 fantasy points per game. Like, if you're not getting me 20 fantasy points per game or higher, then you're replaceable, in my opinion, at the quarterback position in fantasy. Like, there are other ways that you can get that type of production. So, yes, they did add Stephon Diggs. He was really helpful in Buffalo last year. We all saw that at the end of last year. He was really helping out Josh Allen. Look, I just think that we're overvaluing his passing efficiency from last year, which is shown not to be necessarily as sticky year over year, when the sticky stat is actually rushing production. Like, that's something that actually is sticky over year. And CJ Stroud doesn't run. So if I'm going to take an immobile quarterback, why don't I just take Joe Burrow like several rounds after CJ Stroud? I waxed poetic about the Bengals and how I think Joe Burrow can melt faces this year. We've already seen him average over 20 fantasy points per game. Like, why? Like, what's the big difference between the two quarterbacks? Like, again, you could say, oh, I'm more concerned about Burrow and the injury. Okay, that's a fair argument. But if these guys both stay healthy, is anyone going to be surprised if Burrow outscores CJ Stroud? They put up very, very similar numbers. So looking at last year, just specifically, looking at top 6 overall finishes, like on a week-to-week basis, CJ Stroud and Joe Burrow both had 2. Both of them. Joe Burrow played in 6 less games.
There you go. And also, you bring up the ability to pivot. Andrew's giving you the ability to not only just switch quarterback, but if you pass up on CJ Stroud at around 50 overall on underdog and you take Joe Burrow, they have a 24 pick difference, a 2-round difference. And Andrew, you're saying Joe Burrow outscores him this year.
Yeah, and I think too, if you want to get exposure to the Texans offense, just draft one of his receivers instead of drafting CJ Stroud, right? They're kind of all kind of going in a similar range. So yeah, you kind of hedge your bets and be like, well, I don't know which receiver is going to pop off, so I'll just take Stroud. Well, I just say, why don't you just take Nico Collins, and pair him with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase? I think that sounds pretty good.
I love it. And I'll start with my highest ranked guy, and that's Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan Taylor right now is going at 16 overall on underdog. So for me, it's not only the running back position where I don't see Jonathan Taylor as a player that is going to challenge for RB1 overall status. And if I'm drafting a guy at 16 overall, then I want that player to be challenging for RB1 overall. Jonathan Taylor in his RB1 overall season, he only had 40 receptions. The RB1 overall has averaged like 80 catches a year for the last 11 years. Taylor has really no shot of doing that. The big argument is Jonathan Taylor is going to be unlocked by Anthony Richardson in this Colts offense. I just don't see it for 16 overall. In fact, I think Josh Jacobs is a player you can pivot to, and I can get him at pick 38 overall. So a 22 spot difference between Jonathan Taylor and Josh Jacobs. With Josh Jacobs, I think he's going to catch more passes. I think that the Green Bay offense could be better than the Indianapolis offense. And I don't have to worry about Jordan Love is going to produce with running stats, but not to the extent that Anthony Richardson's going to. I don't have to worry about getting vultured quite as much as I do with Jonathan Taylor. I think Jonathan Taylor, people are chasing that 2021 season with this current ADP, and he's a player that I would fade at 16 overall. Josh Jacobs at pick 38 overall, similar production, 22 picks later.
I like the call. I think Josh Jacobs is, and a lot of this running back conversation too, when it comes to fades, it seems like it is pretty easy to kind of find I don't like this running back, but I like this running back going 3 rounds later, because that's kind of just how the running back position is nowadays. You're looking for projectable volume. You're looking for, hey, is this guy playing on a good offense? But like you said, Josh Jacobs has much less competition when it comes to getting those goal line carries. And it's interesting because people will point at Jordan Love and his pretty high touchdown pass rate. Well, that's because A.J. Dillon kept running into the backs of his offensive linemen every time he got the goal line touches, and Aaron Jones was hurt. So if we see Jordan Love take a step back in terms of just passing touchdowns, but the overall offense stays the same, who's going to benefit the most? The goal line back, which in this case seems like it's going to be Josh Jacobs.
I also think it's interesting that we saw Aaron Jones, who's a beloved Green Bay Packer, has an unbelievable playoff run, goes nuts against the Dallas Cowboys, plays great. And in game 2 against the 49ers, then they immediately move on from him and sign Josh Jacobs. Green Bay is going to use Jacobs a lot, that offense to score a lot of points. Give us your next fade and pivot.
Yeah, so for me, Derrick Henry is just becoming too expensive for me in this Heisman backfield. I know that the Ravens offense is really exciting. You have Derrick Henry, you have Lamar Jackson. He's going to be running through wide open lanes. It's going to be great. I don't think that it's going to necessarily be as smooth sailing as the ADP would suggest. I mean, you're looking at this Ravens team. They're facing one of the most difficult schedules in the NFL this year. Week 1, they play the Kansas City Chiefs. So what happens when the Ravens fall behind in games? Is Derrick Henry on the field? No. We have a long track record of him not catching passes. We have a even longer track record of Lamar Jackson never throwing the ball to running backs because he's a mobile quarterback, and we just don't necessarily ever really see that play out. So Derrick Henry, to me, yes, probably better in the best ball format because we're going to see games where the Ravens are dominating and they can run up the score and they're going to feed Derrick Henry. But traditionally, this offense, whether it's been Greg Roman, whether it was Todd Monken last year, they haven't really relied on one running back. Gus Edwards, as good as he was at scoring touchdowns last year, he was never really their featured piece in a lot of games when it came to total carry amounts. And how did Derrick Henry be productive in the Titans offense? Because he was the entire offense. They had to give him 20 to 25 carries for him to be good. Look at all the first half box carries for Derrick Henry. It's 10 for 40. It's just it usually was not good. It was all in the second half where they would just continue to keep feeding him because that was the offensive philosophy. Is that the offensive philosophy with Todd Monken? Now, maybe it can change a little bit from last year, but I still think this offense wants to be fast and play fast and throw the ball with Lamar Jackson. So, look, Derrick Henry, to me, I think that there's enough red flags in his profile where he doesn't catch passes. Yes, the touchdowns are obviously scary, especially with Gus Edwards scoring so many last year. But in the games where he's not scoring, like I think he's going to be a bust for your lineup more often than not. So for me, if I'm going to draft a running back and a high-powered offense that is probably going to play on all 3 downs, instead, Joe Mixon, the Houston Texans. Like, I was concerned when they first traded for Joe Mixon, basically like a 7th-round pick, but then they signed him to extension. Like, we know that the team does not favor, this current coaching staff does not favor Dameon Pierce. They basically did not draft anybody in the NFL draft except Jorah Jordan, I believe is his name. So, like, the Texans, to me, it's like Joe Mixon is just like slated up to be a 3-down workhorse in a Devin Singletary-esque role like we saw last year, and he plays on a really good offense. So I'll take Joe Mixon to catch his passes more than Derrick Henry. I think he has similar touchdown upside to Derrick Henry playing in the CJ Stroud offense. So again, if you're going to fade Stroud, the player, there are still ways to get access to the Houston Texans offense that I also like instead. So if I don't draft Stroud, I'll just take Joe Mixon, and that hopefully that he benefits from the offense still being above average.
Very interesting take with the Joe Mixon one. I think Joe Mixon is a value where he's going. Also, the lack of faith that Houston seems to have in Dameon Pierce. He might not be a Houston Texan to start out the season. There's really no running back 2 that's going to take away work from Joe Mixon. But it's interesting you have Derrick Henry as the fade there. I think that's an interesting one. Sort of that's one of the big storylines of the offseason is he's been able to impose his will on the offensive philosophy in Tennessee every year, led the NFL in carries for 4 out of 5 years. And the only year he didn't land in number 1, he would have, but he went down to injury like midway through the season, and he was still top 10 in carries. So I can understand the Derrick Henry fade. He's also old, Andrew. Like, that's the one thing. Like, we don't talk about him anymore. Like, we're not allowed to fade him because of age anymore because it's burned people for like 5 years. But he's old. He's really old. You're going to talk about a 30-year-old running back. So that's an interesting one. But for me, I do think that he's going to impact the Baltimore offense. Now, whether he returns value at ADP, I think stylistically, it's just sort of every offensive coordinator attached to Derrick Henry has fed him the rock. Is that going to affect Lamar Jackson even a little bit? Is he going to lose a few rushing touchdowns here and there? And I don't think Lamar Jackson's going to fall off a cliff, but right now he's being drafted at quarterback 3 overall. That's high. Last year, he's crept up to quarterback 4 overall, but sort of steamed up throughout the summer. Like, he was QB5, QB6, ends up being drafted QB4 when it's all said and done, which was the highest he was drafted since right after his MVP season in year 2 of his career. Now people are sort of like super, super excited. Lamar Jackson, QB3, going ahead of Patrick Mahomes. I am going to fade Lamar Jackson at ADP, and I am going to pivot to Anthony Richardson. So Lamar Jackson goes pick 42.8. Anthony Richardson goes pick 56. And I think at the end of the day, Anthony Richardson is going to outrun Lamar Jackson this year. I think he's going to have more rushing production. I think he's going to have actually more rushing touchdowns. And I just like that 2-round difference, or excuse me, the 1.5-round difference there, where I can pivot away from quarterback. I can clean up with another running back or another wide receiver. I can get a guy like Josh Jacobs right around where Lamar Jackson's going, and then take Anthony Richardson at 14 picks later. So fade Lamar Jackson, take Anthony Richardson, the unknown upside, the year 2 player. Anthony Richardson's going to absolutely eat this year in fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of these guys where the FOMO is real. Like, you don't want to miss out on not drafting Anthony Richardson because of what, I mean, he's Superman, right? I mean, he's the closest thing what he was compared to, like, Cam Newton, right? God, I remember drafting Cam Newton as like a backup quarterback and then him just having that elite MVP season. So yeah, like the allure with Richardson is so massive. And I just think there's a lot of great values at quarterback this year. So even though I may be a little bit higher on Lamar Jackson than you are, I recognize that quarterback is still a value game. And if I really like a receiver or running back that I have to take instead of Lamar Jackson to then pair with Anthony Richardson, I like that combination more than the Lamar Jackson and the running back or receiver or even tight end that I get later, then yeah, I'm going to opt for Anthony Richardson. I think that it's okay to be, especially at quarterback, be price sensitive. Like, there's a lot of good quarterbacks in the NFL now. There's a lot of guys that can throw the ball. There's a lot of guys that can run. So really use those other players as, hey, what's a better combination? What's a better duo? This quarterback here and then this running back receiver later and vice versa. So again, if you really like that other player, I think that just taking the step down in ADP from going from Lamar Jackson to Richardson makes a lot of sense.
Your next name literally gave me pain when I read it. because it's a guy that I have a ton of in Dynasty, and anybody watching Player Profiler knows that I'm a big fan of his. But I can understand, I guess, the fade because he's being drafted number 1 at his position.
Yeah, so Drake London for me for the Atlanta Falcons. And this is just kind of looking back at historically, guys that are the projected breakouts, right? Because that's what Drake London is. Like from a breakout perspective in terms of, okay, has this guy been like a top 24 wide receiver every year in his NFL career? Like Drake London has not done that yet. And I get that there's reasons for that because the quarterback plays horrible, because Arthur Smith hates us, like yada, yada, yada. But like he still had this really strong target share. Okay. Well, who's he competing with targets the last couple of years? An injured Kyle Pitts, right? Like that's what he's been competing with for targets. Okay. So I'm not so like floored by his massive target share in an offense that wasn't good and didn't have a lot of mouths to feed per se. So for me, Drake London, look, 2 years ago was Michael Pittman. He got Matt Ryan. Oh, he's going to the moon. Bust. Last year, Chris Olave. I talked bad about Chris Olave last year coming on one of these shows.
On my show. Yeah, you were.
And people pushed back because I was like, this is the same spiel we had with Michael Pittman. He's the projected breakout that we're drafting like he already broke out. Like if Drake London has a good year this year with Kirk Cousins, a career year, catches touchdowns, aren't we just drafting him in the same place we're drafting him now? Or maybe he's going a little bit higher. But like we're drafting him like the breakout has already happened. When he has a brand new quarterback, he has an offensive coordinator that has never called plays before. They play week 1, they play the Pittsburgh Steelers. Is that going to be a great matchup for Drake London? And why is Drake London just the obvious number 1? What about Kyle Pitts? Why can't he be the number 1 in this offense? Like he was drafted really high in the draft too. He's not going to be injured anymore. So I just see like a lot of holes in Drake London where he's just so expensive. Like I get the allure with him. I get the upside, but it's all baked into the ADP where I'm like, look, man, I'm afraid of fading a Kirk Cousins receiver. Like this is how I felt about Derek Carr and Chris Olave last year. I was like, I'm not afraid of Derek Carr. I'm not afraid of Kirk Cousins. And people will look at, well, Justin Jefferson. Well, I think Justin Jefferson is on a different planet than any other receiver Kirk Cousins has had. So like, for me, I'm not afraid of fading Drake London. Like, how is this guy going to hurt me? I just don't see it. So for me, I'd rather fade Drake London at his round 2 ADP, where he's never even come close to finishing the last 2 years of his NFL career, and just take a shot on George Pickens, right? George Pickens is much cheaper. Yes, he has Arthur Smith, which is absolutely horrible and could be disastrous, but the price of admission for him as a round 5, round 6 pick, I feel much better about taking when I think he has very similar breakout potential. Like we saw him last year actually put up fantasy wide receiver 1 numbers when Deontay Johnson wasn't playing, when he had Mason Rudolph as his quarterback. Like we actually saw him put up spurts of wide receiver 1 production. We've never seen that from Drake London. All we've seen from Drake London is him put up a high target share. Great. Doesn't score touchdowns. And George Pickens has also had bad quarterback play too. So again, I get why their difference in ADP, because the peripheral metrics or the situation is definitely better for Drake London, getting Kirk Cousins, where you still have quarterback questions with George Pickens. But I think that the price to me is like, I would rather take a shot on George Pickens breakout, where it actually is going to help me in the long run because he's going to beat his ADP significantly. If Drake London breaks out, then he's just meeting his ADP at this point.
Yeah, definitely a very interesting one. I've taken the bullish approach on Drake London, certainly pouring cold water on that one. I think the one thing you brought up with the Kyle Pitts taking a huge step forward, so you can build that Atlanta offense breaks out into your draft plan by drafting the cheaper player at a position with less interesting players available. So it's sort of an arbitrage play where you could get similar production, but the fact that it's a tight end matters so much more. So I think that was definitely an interesting one, but a little very depressing. Anybody who listens to the previous press coverage where I had Dave Kluge on, we talked about a bull case for Drake London. Andrew's definitely pouring ice water on it. So you can measure these things out. For me, I'm going to go with a very easy fade here. Why would I draft Kyren Williams at the end of the 2nd round when I could draft Devon Achane at the beginning of the 3rd round? And Kyren Williams is sort of like dug in here. And I think Kyren Williams is going to have impactful games for sure. He was terrific last year, but I don't see him holding up. They drafted Blake Corum for a reason. They spent a 3rd round pick on Blake Corum, who was an incredibly productive player at Michigan. Now, did they draft him to replace Kyren Williams? I don't necessarily think so, but I think they drafted him with the idea that this sort of volume for Kyren Williams is unsustainable. This is not what Kyren Williams is. This is not the profile of his player. and we want to protect ourselves with Blake Corum. Now, for me, I can take Devon Achane a few picks later, and I think at the end of the day, their fantasy points per game will be similar, and I think there's a good chance that Devon Achane could outscore Kyren Williams completely. So right now, Kyren Williams has an ADP of pick 21, and Devon Achane, you see him right around pick 26. Sometimes you get him as late as like pick 28, and in redraft, you're seeing Kyren Williams going ahead of Achane as well. So I think Kyren Williams managers have sort of settled in saying, okay. Blake Corum's the backup. But at the end of the day, I think the Rams are saying we need a good backup for a reason. We don't trust this player's ability to withstand the sort of workload that the RB1 gets in the Sean McVay offense.
Yeah, I agree with you with Achane over Kyren Williams. I think that we get trapped sometimes when we look at a player's role, right? Why do we love Kyren Williams? Why do we love him last? Because of the role, right? I mean, I think that maybe he's underrated as a running back per se. Like maybe he shouldn't have been a round 6 pick, but at the end of the day, like we're drafting him because we want his role from last year. Whereas with Achane, we love the player. Like we love the explosiveness. We love that he can command and demand that Mike McDaniel gives him a role in the offense. Kyren Williams is being bestowed a role in the offense because Sean McVay likes him, or at least likes him more than the other running backs on the team. So yeah, you don't need to convince me with going with Achane over Kyren.
All right, break everybody's hearts again. Who's your next fade?
Deebo Samuel. I just don't think that this is going to be the year for. I love Brandon Ayuk. Look, Deebo Samuel for me last year, kind of the planets aligned a little bit for him, especially with him and Christian McCaffrey. He was second, I believe, in total red zone touches for a wide receiver. So again, looking at, okay, is there any potential regression coming for this certain player? We've seen Deebo Samuel in years past get banged up. How sustainable is his rushing efficiency from year over year? For me, it's just, I just think Brandon Ayuk is an ascending rocket that's going to the moon. Just like he's such a player that we're just waiting for this cusp of an absolute face melting breakout where he's been on the cusp of it the last couple of years, but just the target volume hasn't been there for him. If Deebo were to go down, like I just think that Brandon Ayuk would just take over this offense and just be that clear cut number one wide receiver. So I have Brandon Ayuk ranked over Deebo Samuel, and Deebo, I just think you're playing with a little bit of fire with him, just given his injury history, given the fact that the 49ers have kind of floated out, hey, we want to trade this guy. They didn't trade him on draft night because they weren't sure about like the whole physical thing. It's like he's got to pass a physical, which is kind of complicated when you're doing it on draft night. So for me, I think Deebo Samuel's a little bit overvalued, and I'd rather just take a safe, productive receiver that's a little bit older as well, Amari Cooper. Look, Amari Cooper was really good, productive last year with 4 different quarterbacks. Like he's a guy that nobody really wants to draft, but he gets it done. And what did we see in the fantasy playoffs when you needed him most? He put up a 50 burger.
Yeah.
He delivered
completely. Completely did. And also with the Ken Dorsey offense, it seems like it's going to be a little bit more pedal to the metal. At least that's what they're going to try to do. There's going to be a lot of RPOs. It seems like this could be tailor-made for Amari Cooper, and he's sort of flying under the radar. So definitely a disappointing to hear you fading Deebo, one of the more likable players in the NFL. But I'm completely with you. I feel much more comfortable betting on Brandon Ayuk than I do Deebo. Deebo's also 28, and it just feels like he's breaking down more and more every year and never gets the targets. Never, ever gets the targets. It's sort of a incredibly efficient player. He's only had one season with a noticeable amount of targets. Every other year, it's like shocking how productive he is despite the targets. So I like that one.
And you also, too, can't forget, the last game that the 49ers played, Deebo Samuel could not get open. Like, he could not, like, how many targets did Brock Purdy pepper him in the Super Bowl to incomplete? Yeah. And I know he was dealing with like a shoulder injury at the time, but again, that's part of the Deebo package. He's going to be dealing with injuries all the time. And what do? They drafted Ricky Pearsall in round 1 as a guy that gets open against man coverage, right? So they're already looking for alternatives to like, hey, like if Deebo's not as effective as he used to be, like we need to have a backup plan. So the 49ers have been telling us like how they feel about Deebo as a declining asset. Like you're trying to get out from underneath it before it totally like hits rock bottom in terms of his value. So again, as a fantasy manager, I'm trying to get out now while he's still kind of viewed pretty highly and kind of pivot to other options.
Yeah, definitely a good one. And for me, I'll stay at the wide receiver position, and I'm going to go with a very, very tight ADP here. Stephon Diggs has seemed up to pick 26 overall. Andrew discussed sort of the decline we saw from Diggs to end last season. Anybody who rostered him, he had such a gross split where he was like a top 3 wide receiver in fantasy through like the first 10 weeks of the year. And then over the last 8 weeks of the year, it completely fell off. He was like below wide receiver 3 land. Really, really disappointing end of the year. Now he gets sort of a fantasy life preserver. He gets attached to CJ Stroud, and now people are pushing him up. He's got Nico Collins there. He's got Tank Dell. Big time target competition. I think it could end up being an offense where a different player sort of spikes every single week, but I would not bet on Stephon Diggs to have a return on value at 26 overall, even if we see him improve over the second half of last year, which really wouldn't be a hard thing for him to do. 2 picks later, Jaylen Waddle. And you talk about post-hype. Jaylen Waddle had an unbelievable season in 2022. Last year slipped a little bit. This year could be a big bounce back year. Jaylen Waddle has had 3 straight seasons, his only 3 seasons in the league, with 1,000 receiving yards. He's been a very, very steady bet. And if there was ever an injury to Tyreek Hill, Jaylen Waddle would absolutely win leagues. If there was an injury to Tank Dell or Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs would still have to deal with the other one, and it would be sort of a split target share. Jaylen Waddle has a better contingent upside, and I think Jaylen Waddle is just a better bet overall, and I can draft them in the same range. Also, I think Miami has a better offense right now than Houston. I think people are projecting Houston to take this big step. With Miami, we don't necessarily have to do that.
I agree. I think Waddle is like the quintessential post-hype sleeper because you look at his efficiency metrics last year, they were still really good. Like he had a career high in yards per route run, career high PFF receiving grade. So yeah, like he got banged up, didn't really score as many touchdowns, but you want to buy low on the guys that we know are good that don't score a lot of touchdowns because the next year, usually things kind of regress to the mean and you're going to see him score more touchdowns, especially if it's not the Tyreek Hill show like it was past year. He's another year older. He's turning 30 this year. So I think that Jaylen Waddle is a home run pick. I love taking him in round 3.
All right, give us your next fade and pivot.
All right, so going to the tight end position. So Sam LaPorta is the tight end 1 across basically most ADPs. So I'm just going to fade the tight end 1 because tight ends just traditionally, again, if your name's not Travis Kelce, like how many times are we going to do this? Like we get one guy that gets schemed up all the way to be the tight end 1. He gets drafted really high, and then he's just not as good as he was the year before because the tight end position by nature of it is very injury prone, very touchdown dependent, a lot of things that are hard to carry over from year to year. So I don't want to take the leap of faith that Sam LaPorta is just going to take another step forward. Again, he was really, really good as a rookie. Like he was an amazing pick last year, especially if you could get him like in the double-digit rounds, and he ended up being basically tight end 1. Whereas, why can't I just draft Mark Andrews like a couple rounds later? Like I think he has tight end 1 overall upside. His best season in 2021, he was at near 14.3 fantasy points per game in half PPR scoring. That blew Sam LaPorta's points per game out of the water this past season. We've already seen Mark Andrews put up a season better than Sam LaPorta's last year. Mark Andrews, before his injury, was averaging just as many fantasy points per game as Sam LaPorta did. And he's 3 rounds cheaper. So for me, again, with these onesie positions, I'm really trying to look for value. And if I see 5 different players, I think there are 5 different tight ends that have a really strong case, including your guy, Dalton Kincaid, Theo. He's in there as well. I think that there's a strong case for 5 different tight ends to be the tight end 1 overall. And I want to take the guy that goes the latest. And that's usually either Mark Andrews or Dalton Kincaid. So that's why I like Andrews over LaPorta when you're considering the ADPs.
What's interesting is it was you and Debro and was it Pat was the third one?
It was all of us. Everyone at FantasyPros has a different tight end 1. Yeah.
So who is Debro on?
Trey McBride.
Okay, and is Pat on LaPorta?
So Pat's on LaPorta, and then Joey P is on Kelce.
Wow, you guys are so split. You guys got to have like a meeting of the minds here. It's going to be your readers are not going to know what to do. They're just going to be just drafting all 4 of them, which I think might not be the worst thing. This year, I think that there's a lot of quality at the tight end position. And as much as I like LaPorta, I like McBride, I like Kincaid, I think there's value even a little bit lower if you want to pivot down. You brought up Kyle Pitts. I think Evan Ingram, you brought up that Jacksonville offense. Evan Ingram's a nice pick. So I think that this is a year where I think elite tight end could be just a wider tier. And you want to kind of get one of those, let's say 7 guys, 6 guys. Weird, because we usually are telling you to either draft early or just punt it for a while. And that's sort of been the historical bet. This year seems a little bit different.
Yeah, and I think the thing with tight ends you always want to keep in mind is every single year we see tight ends that drastically beat their ADPs. And when you take an elite guy, you're removing yourself from that situation where it's just hard for those guys at the top to beat their ADPs, because if they do good and they perform well, then you're basically drafting them based on their expectation, which is why I just, again, if you're not obsessed with any of these individual tight ends, like going quantity later in the rounds and hoping that one guy, I mean, Sam LaPorta wasn't just good because he was the tight end one last year. He was good because he cost you nothing to draft and he made the rest of your roster also better. I think that gets overlooked in just fantasy analysis when we're looking back at the past years. Like, oh, Sam LaPorta was a tight end one. It was absolutely fantastic. But it's like, well, no, he not only was a tight end one, but he was also cost you nothing to draft him, which made the rest of your roster also better. And when you, again, like I said, when you draft a tight end early, like a Sam LaPorta, well, it just makes it that much harder for him to beat his ADP and beat expectations because you're drafting him already super high.
Yeah, definitely an interesting way of looking at it. I think a lot of times people are like, I want to find the next Puka Nacua, I want to find the next Kyren Williams. Well, those guys weren't drafted. So it's like it's definitely a different ball game when you're trying to search for it. But interesting, the tight end position is definitely tilting right now, even though there's multiple guys we like a lot of at the spot. I'm going to go back to the wide receiver well here, and I'm going to talk about T. Higgins as a guy to fade. And not so much because I dislike T. Higgins, but again, I think he's sort of being drafted around a spot that he's not going to crush. Like T. Higgins, we've seen it time and time again where we've been waiting for this massive season, and it just sort of never happens with him. Right now, he's being priced at wide receiver 26, and he's being drafted at 42 overall. I think that's okay, but I think there's a couple of players behind him that could return value. You already referenced George Pickens. I could fade T. Higgins and take George Pickens 3 picks later. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go even further down the list. I'm going to fade T. Higgins at pick 42, and I'm going to take Terry McLaurin at pick 55. We talked about Jayden Daniels earlier in the show. Jayden Daniels, I think, could rise Terry McLaurin to have the best season of his entire career. McLaurin, we've sort of been waiting around. He's had multiple seasons of 70 catches or more, multiple seasons where he's getting in that 1,100 receiving yards. He's a very, very good player, but we've sort of been waiting for that, wow, look what he did in this XYZ year season, where people are like, look at what Terry McLaurin's ceiling was. It was incredible. It's not so much unlike what we saw last year with DJ Moore. DJ Moore was a guy that gave us many good seasons, gets that young, mobile quarterback who sort of elevates his game, and he takes his game to the next level. I think Terry McLaurin could be a wide receiver 1 this year, and I don't see that out of T. Higgins, and I can get Terry McLaurin 15 picks later. I also think what Washington did in the draft, getting, and free agency for that matter, getting Austin Eckler to go with Brian Robinson, and then drafting McCaffrey, drafting Sanat, having Jahan Dotson bounce back potential. None of these guys have conflicting skill sets with McLaurin. McLaurin's the alpha there. McLaurin's going to have the big year. That is the bet on Jayden Daniels. I think he rises Terry McLaurin's production as well. Fade T. Higgins, draft Terry McLaurin.
And I think too, even if Daniels doesn't, fire as this, CJ Stroud-esque type of rookie quarterback, I mean, Terry McLaurin's still going to be a wide receiver 2 at the end of the day, because that's all he does. That's all he's been able to do with horrible quarterback play anyway. So I love the floor ceiling combination with him, because I think at worst, okay, McLaurin, like, he's fine. Like, he reaches his ADP. Like, he doesn't kill you. Like, he's a player that you can feel safe about, where even if he doesn't have or unlock his ceiling, okay, like, he's still going to pay off for where you drafted him. But then you also are now, okay, what's the potential for a ceiling play here with Terry McLaurin? So I think I got to move Terry up. You got me convinced, Theo.
I'm on Terry. I picked him up in a dynasty league. I just think this is a Magic Johnson took him out to eat. Like, the Washington, I think, wants Terry McLaurin to be a big thing this year. He's sort of always been this team leader in the locker room, a guy that players sort of gravitate towards. And he's just had a very unlucky career in terms of his quarterback play attached to him and sort of the team's success. This could be like the big goodwill season for Terry. I like the storyline. And and again, if we're wrong on Jayden Daniels and he's not as good as we think, a lot of times you see these rookie quarterbacks keying in on their primary target and have sort of tunnel vision when things go poorly. So there's a lot of outs for Terry McLaurin to return value where he's being drafted.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more.
All right, you have one more fade, if my math is correct.
Yep. So I'm going to slot receivers now. So Jaden Reed, I'm going to fade Jaden Reed, even though I absolutely loved him coming out of college. Thought he was a great pick last year. He scored a ton of touchdowns for the Green Bay Packers, but just doing the target shares every single week for the Green Bay Packers offense. And I don't know if there is an alpha in this offense that you can like reliably trust to be the number one target every single week. Like Jaden Reed by default is being put there because of how good he was last year, but there's a lot of injuries. Christian Watson wasn't playing. But you saw guys like Romeo Doubs, he produced. Dontavian Wicks, he has a hive building. Like, we like him as a sleeper. You have the 2 tight ends. And it just sucks for Reed because he just happens to be the guy that scored the most touchdowns. So that's why he's being drafted first. But you don't have to squint to see another receiver in this offense potentially out-targeting him, especially when you look at his role in the slot where he's not even like a full-time player in this offense. And that's concerning considering where you have to draft him in round 5 attached to Jordan Love, who we're just hoping kind of carries over that second half performance into next season. So I think Jaden Reed, as good as he was as a rookie last year, like very touchdown dependent. And I have concerns about the target volume he's going to get in this offense. Whereas with Chris Godwin, I mean, he's another player that I'm looking at as like a post-hype guy. Liam Cohen's coming in. He's already talked about him being in the Cooper Kupp role in the slot. Like I couldn't actually remember, like when I looked at it last year, I was like, oh my God, Godwin like did not play the slot like at all last year. Like he had a career low in terms of his slot rate. And that's why he wasn't as productive, even though he still led the team in receptions and targets. The yardage wasn't there. And obviously we saw Mike Evans score all the touchdowns. So if we see that kind of level out where Godwin is now scoring as many touchdowns as Evans, like they're both scoring in the more to 6 to 7 range, well, Chris Godwin could just absolutely feast in this offense. Like I have no concerns about where Godwin's target share is going to be with Baker Mayfield and this Liam Cohen offense. Whereas with Jaden Reed, I have major question marks. So the fact that you can get a slot receiver who Chris Godwin was a fantasy wide receiver 1 before, like he has proven production, like he's done it before. Another year removed from that really devastating knee injury. I think Chris Godwin going outside the top 40 receivers. Are there really 40 receivers better than Chris Godwin? I don't think so. So for me, Chris Godwin, I think he's one of the cheapest slot receivers you can get. That's going to put up a ton of production.
Yeah, we love seeing Godwin go back to the slot. And I think that it was interesting because when Jalen McMillan was drafted, a lot of people thought maybe he would play the slot, and they clarified it very quickly that it's going to be Godwin. So Trey Palmer, Jalen McMillan on the outside, Mike Evans in the Mike Evans role, and then Godwin getting, a significant increase in targets. Interesting one. I really like that pivot. My last pivot, it's a little further down the list, but I'll save you a little bit here. Aaron Jones. There's sort of a hive that likes Aaron Jones right now, and I don't. You're talking about a 29-year-old running back. He was great in the fantasy playoffs, and I think that's sort of like everybody sort of remembers Aaron Jones playing really well in those 2 games. Well, Green Bay told you what they thought about Aaron Jones when they pivoted over to Josh Jacobs this year, and Aaron Jones now goes to a divisional rival in the Minnesota Vikings, and he steamed up to RB18 overall. He played 12 games last year. Aaron Jones has missed significant portions of multiple seasons, including only playing 12 games last year. But it's sort of a recency bias for drafters with the NFL playoffs. I can pivot down 20 picks. Aaron Jones goes pick 71. I can pivot down to pick 91, and I can get Jaylen Warren, who's going off the board at RB 25 right now in Underdog, as opposed to Jones, who's running back 18. And we talk about Arthur Smith, and it's sort of a joke, but Arthur Smith does one thing very, very well for us in fantasy. He gets running back production, whether it's Tyler Algier getting 1,000 rushing yard season, whether it's Cordero Patterson having one of the biggest out there running back 1 seasons of all time, certainly Derrick Henry's big-time season, and Bijan Robinson an RB1 as a rookie. Now, Jaylen Warren has Najee Harris to deal with, but he outproduced him last year. And I think there's sort of a Najee Harris is the bet, hive mind keep creeping back in. Najee Harris is actually being drafted ahead of Jaylen Warren. I think that's a mistake. Pittsburgh is not giving an extension to Najee Harris. I think Jaylen Warren is going to continue outproducing him this year. And I think he's got an outside chance of being like a top 15 running back this year. Warren is also going to benefit from Deontay Johnson moving on and a sort of lack of pass catching weapons. I think he'll be utilized out of the backfield a little bit more as a receiver. And I think that they also improved the offensive line tremendously in the NFL draft there in Pittsburgh. A lot to like about Jaylen Warren. He's been sort of an easy click for me on Underdog throughout all these drafts in the early offseason, and Jones has been a fade.
Yeah, I think that Jaylen Warren is such a great pick. I think that it's very telling with a running back where the starter doesn't even get hurt, and yet this backup running back is still finding their way to get onto the field, right? They're earning their way. They're making the coaches put this guy in the game. It's not an Alexander Madison situation where, oh, well, Dalvin Cook's hurt. Okay, here you go. Now you can play. Oh, and you play pretty well. But Jaylen Warren, again, has been forcing his way onto the field despite the fact that they drafted Najee Harris in the first round. And like you mentioned, they declined the 5th-year option. Like, the writing is on the wall that if Najee Harris starts out slow again for the 3rd straight year, because that's been the last 2 seasons, he started out horribly and has saved his season in the second half of both years under a new offensive coordinator in his last year of the contract. He's not going to get a chance to get the job back in the second half if he starts out slow again. So yeah, I have Jaylen Warren ranked ahead of Najee Harris, and Aaron Jones. I think it's a great pivot.
Yeah, so this was awesome. I told you 45 minutes, and we're already here at an hour and 5. You've been very generous with your time and your takes, as always, Andrew. Let everybody know what you have coming out once again and where they could find your work.
Yep. So everything you can find is over on fantasypros.com. Like I said at the top, I did a big strategy article kind of talking about my early snake draft picks, kind of my approach in the early rounds, going to the middle and then late rounds. So name drop some players that I'm targeting in best ball and some early drafts. And the fantasy football draft kit for Fantasy Pros is dropping on June 1st. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, and definitely check out Andrew's work over at Fantasy Pros and stick with us here at Press Coverage. We are going to cover all the subjects you need to crush your fantasy leagues this season. We'll see you soon.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.